Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are logging in from. This is Feedback Without Fear coaching that builds employee engagement and retention. And for those of you who don't know who we are, I am Greg Owen-Boger. I am the EVP of Learning and Business Development here at Turpin Communication. And co-facilitating today with me is Dale Ludwig, our president and founder. Dale, say hello.
Everybody.
And we also have Kevin Vogelsang, our Director of Operations, with us. He is performing the role of host, and he'll be taking good care of us and making sure that we have a favorable video and audio experience. And if you have any technical issues, Kevin is your guy as we proceed. So for those of you who do not know who Turpin Communication is, we work with individual contributors, managers, leaders, and executives to help them be more effective in their group communications. And in that spirit, we work with presenters, meeting facilitators, and trainers. And over the years, Dale and I have co-authored a handful of books. The Virtual Orderly Conversation is one that we will give you access to a little bit later. The one on the left, on the lower left-hand corner of the screen, is the orderly conversation, and that concept is going to become quite central to the work that we are doing as we work with you on how to provide feedback to other individuals. So what exactly is an orderly conversation? Well, an orderly conversation is any type of business communication that is carefully thought through, organized, and detailed, and yet conversationally executed. So you could say that today we are having an orderly conversation because our team has put some time and effort into designing the way this webinar is going to play out. And yet we want it to feel like a conversation, which means we invite you to chime in, take yourself off mute, ask questions, or even drop into chat. And I can see that a couple people are bantering right now in chat. That's awesome. But this is an orderly conversation. But this concept of an orderly conversation applies to all different types of group conversation and communication in the workplace. Now, the target audience for today's webinar, you can see leaders, managers, sales managers in particular, and that will make more sense as we get into our feedback model, aspiring managers, and mentors. So in other words, if you provide feedback to other people, specifically on their communication skills, you are in the right spot. This is a screen grab of TD Magazine. It's a publication of the Association for Talent Development, and this particular publication came out a few years ago, but one of the research reports that they had a few years ago, I think is absolutely relevant to the work that we're doing right now. And as you can see, it says that disengaged employees are flight risks. Workers want growth, flexibility, and wait for it, communication. Now, they go on to say that there are 6 primary reasons that employees leave organizations. The top one is poor leadership communication. And they go on to say that 35% of exiting employees, in other words, employees who are leaving, said that they experienced transparent communication throughout all levels of the organization. So think about that. Only 35% of exiting employees said that they felt that communication was transparent at their workplace. The number 5 reason that employees leave is inadequate employee and leadership feedback. It goes on to say that employees are 2 times more likely to be highly engaged when they agree that their manager regularly gives them feedback to improve their performance. And employees who regularly receive constructive feedback are also less likely to be searching for other jobs and are 2 times more likely to say that they'll be working at their current company in the next year. So you can see that high quality feedback and communication is absolutely critical to employees' success. And yet, is anyone surprised that oftentimes the workplace feels like this, in part because of a lack of communication? So let's get at it. Feedback without fear, coaching that builds employee engagement and retention. So our agenda looks like this today. We are going to work through mutually beneficial relationships. In other words, in order for feedback to make sense, there has to be an existing relationship. Second, establishing connection and credibility. If you aren't credible, the feedback you provide them is not going to land as well as you want it to. And finally, we'll get into coaching others in the moment.
Step one here, we're going to talk about mutually beneficial relationships and what the success factors are in those relationships. And I think before we get into all of that, I want to talk a bit about what the challenges are for coaching. Okay, these came from that question you answered when you registered for the class, what are the challenges you're facing? Here are some of the things you said. You want to be positive and constructive, which is often difficult if you're delivering information that's not such good news to the person you're coaching. You're concerned about how feedback is received, knowing how to set the stage. I mean, how do you begin giving feedback? Well, how do you get that conversation started? And of course, you don't want to make it personal or make it too personal or hurt people's feelings. You want to be clear and specific, wanting to be kind yet constructive. That was a real theme running through a lot of these. I mean, how do you give someone feedback without making them feel bad? And I think that's one of the big issues that we all face. And that's one of the themes that's going to run through this webinar. Avoiding conflict is shying away from giving feedback. In other words, oh, I don't want to talk to this person. I think it's going to be bad. I think I know them. I don't think it's going to go well. So I'll just avoid giving feedback. Person being coached is resistant and defensive, in particular attorneys. So that did not surprise me. It sort of made me smile. I've worked with attorneys, I've worked with doctors. They are very difficult to give feedback to because their egos are sometimes very large. And then finally, the person being coached spirals into a negative headspace. This is really an interesting one because the person you're coaching might go into the process so defensive that anything you say just sets them off and they don't know how to handle it. They don't know how to take it. So we'll try to find some solutions to that sort of issue as well as we go forward. There are also challenges receiving feedback, and I'm sure we've all experienced this. It's difficult to change habits. It's hard not to be resistant or defensive. It's hard not to take things personally. And of course, the really important one here is it's easy to be overwhelmed. If you're the person giving feedback and you give too much, that person doesn't know where to start. There's too much information. There are too many things to think about, and you haven't made it easy for them to take the feedback. So you don't want to overwhelm them with the feedback you're giving them. So the success factors involved, there are two things here in this oval. One, mutual trust. There needs to be trust between you and the person that you're giving feedback to, and there also need to be clear goals. This requires empathy from the coach and also the employee's desire to improve. Now, you may be working with people who don't want to improve, and there's really nothing you can do about that if they don't want to make any effort to take the feedback that you're giving them. So I think we need to acknowledge that fact that sometimes it's not going to work, and sometimes it's not your fault. But I do want to talk about setting clear goals. So I think that is a step in the process that is often missed. And so we want to make sure that we're actually backing up far enough from the actual event that you're giving someone feedback on to think about how they want to come across. Now, this is a word cloud about the title says, what does it? Covered by my video thing. How do you want to be perceived by the people you work with and for? This is my list of the ways I want to be perceived: open conversation, authentic, empathetic, great listener. All of these things are, no one doesn't want these things, but getting someone to articulate what their goals are is a really good first step. Oops, wrong way. So you want to ask people how they want to be perceived. That's at the very beginning of this process. Sorry, I'm having keyboard issues here. So what we've actually just done, when you do that, you are taking the first step in the feedback model that Greg's going to be going through in a little bit. How do you want to be perceived? Get someone talking about how they want other people of all types to perceive them. Maybe they work with a couple of different audiences, a couple of different groups, get them talking about all of those things. Have some clear goals in mind so that you can base your feedback on those goals. So step one, get people talking about how they want to be perceived. Next item on the agenda, establish connection and credibility. I think that showing up and being a role model for someone that you're coaching is a really important step. So let's talk a little bit about what's involved with that. First, a question for you all. Have you ever received unwelcome or inappropriate feedback, and what made it problematic for you? This is on the receiving end of
Feel
feedback.
free to take yourself off mute or drop answers into chat. Either is fine. Oh, Kelly Knowles,
Kelly,
you were told you needed to
classic.
smile more. Yep, classic. Not a good way to start
Not
any sort of
good.
feedback.
Definitely. And it's made me very cautious about how I provide feedback. Okay. Good point.
Yes. Sarah, are you comfortable sharing with us what sort of feedback you've received in the past that made
Um,
you feel that way?
yeah, and so the feedback I'm thinking of specifically was really almost like a person, like it was very vague. And it was like, you need better leadership. And I'm like, okay, help me understand, right? Like that feels more like criticism as opposed
Right.
to, hey, in this situation, X, Y, maybe you could have done X, Y, Z instead, right? So it felt like a personal attack because it was so vague. And it also left me spinning and questioning everything because I was like, well, what do they mean here?
Yes.
I
Gregory
wish.
says only hearing. Sorry.
Go ahead, Dale.
Oh, just wanted to point out that Gregory said only hear negative feedback. That's a problem. Made to feel like I failed from Eric. Yep.
Yeah. I wish I could
Those two are
say that
related.
these are the first time we've ever heard any of this, but Sarah, your point about vague and it's not the feedback you received wasn't actionable, and it was such a big thing that it made you start to rethink everything or at least second guess your own leadership skills. That can be quite uh, damaging to the ego and to your ego. So we want to learn how not to do that.
Justin says how message was delivered. That's important. We'll be talking about that in a minute. Victoria, I was told that I make some people feel uncomfortable because I ask the hard questions for the business. And then Sarah says, yes, exactly. I don't ever want to that. I don't ever want to do that to someone else. Got it. Sorry, I can't read this morning. Sense of frustration during feedback. All of these are common. I've experienced feedback early in my career that I thought that makes me mad and that is useless. Though that combination of responses from me just didn't feedback. There was no way I could take that in or do anything about it. So I think that helping people take in the feedback and helping them know what to do about it is really kind of one of our major themes today. So thank you all very much for all of that. Let me reshare my screen. I can get it where I want it here. Sure. Okay. So, big point here, feedback must come from a credible source. So that means you need to be seem credible from the person that you're giving feedback to. And as a coach, how you show up both emotionally and physically matters. And for those of you that have had the negative responses to feedback, you know how important this is. You really want someone giving you feedback who appears to understand what its potential impact might be. And their job should be to help you take the feedback and do something about it as easily as possible. And it starts with real fundamental things. So, what does showing up mean? Means you're curious and you're listening really well. You're being present and engaged as you deliver feedback. You're self aware. So, in other words, you want them to be self aware. You also have to be self aware in terms of how you're coming across. You need to appear ready and able. And you need to have appropriate energy. All of those things are really important because these sorts of interactions do have the potential to go south really fast. So you want to make sure that you're setting the tone, you're setting the example as you're delivering feedback. So we're talking about some how-tos for these first three, being curious and listening, being present and engaged, and being self-aware. Okay, let's talk about being engaged. Now this is for, let's look at this on a couple of levels. This is from your perspective as the person giving the feedback, you need to be engaged. But you also want to give the people you're coaching feedback on how engaged they are in the interaction that you're giving them uh, coaching on. So let's define this term. As you can see on the right, thinking on your feet is the most fundamental way to look at being engaged. In other words, your mind is clear, you're able to talk clearly, you're present, you're right here, right now. So you're in the moment, you're self-aware and in control, you're connected with the individual that you're talking to, you're able to read the room, in other words, read that person, you're able to see how they're responding and respond to that as you're delivering feedback. You're talking with and not at. Going back to the idea that it needs to be a conversation is really important because you don't want to go in and just look at your notes that you took when you were preparing to give feedback and read through them. You want to make sure it's a conversation with that person that you're coaching so that they feel comfortable interacting with you. And when you do all of these things, when you get engaged, you're going to feel more comfortable with the process. Because if I were going to go in, try to coach someone, I would have to make sure that my head was in the right spot and I wasn't anxious, I wasn't upset, I wasn't worried about how things were going to go. And the one way to do that is to make sure that you're really engaged in that conversation and really paying attention to that person that you're coaching. Now, when you're not engaged, of course, you're in your head, you worry about being perfect, you think about your voice and your hands and your body, you're focusing on the information, not the explanation, and you might miss cues. Now, think of this from the person you are coaching perspective. You may observe them in whatever situation you observed, and you might see some of these things happening with them. And if you do see that, for example, if they are focusing on the information and not the explanation, in other words, they're just giving the facts and they're not making those facts relevant or important to the people that they're talking to, you could say, you know what, I don't know if you were that engaged because you didn't seem to be focusing on how that person was taking in the information that you're delivering. So you want to think about not only for yourself, but also for them. These are areas that you can look for and trace back to not being fully engaged in the conversation. And we will be talking about that as we move forward. So I'm going to move on now. Oh, one more, experiencing greater nervousness. Obviously the opposite of being comfortable when you are fully engaged. When you're really tense and really nervous, many times it's because you're not engaged. So rather than approaching their nervousness or your own from the outside and saying, well, what are the techniques? How do I stop this nervousness? You start it by getting engaged. You get rid of the nervousness by making sure you're really connected. Okay. So engagement is a foundational skill. It almost always starts here when you're coaching others. Keep that in mind. The first thing you want to talk about with folks is, were you engaged? Were you fully in that conversation? Or was your mind wandering around, thinking about, worrying about other things as you were going through that process? So there are two primary engagement skills. These will come up later. I want to talk about them a bit now. Primary engagement skills, pausing and breathing to think, and eye contact to connect and observe. Now, the one on the right, eye contact, is pretty obvious. If you want to make sure that you're really connected with folks, you want to make sure your eye contact is strong. Pausing and breathing is sometimes really counterintuitive for people. And I think that to, let's say you're coaching someone who reports to you and they're clearly getting way ahead of themselves during the interaction that they're having. It's difficult to boil things down rather than saying, really try to get your head together, really try to stay focused. It's easier to say, pause more, give yourself a chance to think, take a breath, make sure that you're giving yourself the opportunity to catch up with what you're doing. So when we talk about starting with really basic engagement skills, these are the two that we're talking about. Make sure you're really looking at folks and make sure you're giving yourself a chance to think. Greg, I think this goes back to you now.
Yeah, and Dale, it just occurred to me while you were talking there about those two primary engagement skills, pausing and breathing, and eye contact to connect and observe. It may seem to all of you here in today's webinar that that's so basic. Why would you bother starting there? And on one hand, it is very basic, but I'm thinking, Dale, to the workshop that we conducted yesterday. So we were working with a group of high-level executives. They were directors and above, and even they struggled with the basics of getting their head together, being able to make that human connection. So avoid the assumption that that's so basic, I don't need to start there. As Dale said, we almost always start with the very baseline skills of getting people engaged, because we've discovered that if and when someone hits that degree of engagement, oftentimes their other natural skills kick in. But that's harder to do if people aren't actually engaged and in the moment and able to think on their feet. All right.
We're not going to talk, sorry, Greg, we're not going to talk too much about this point, but when we work with people on presentations, and which is a type of orderly conversation, just as a coaching session is, there's always that moment between preparation and beginning the conversation. And that's during that moment is when you want to really connect and engage with the person you're talking to. But your head is in the prep stage. Are you saying what you plan to say? Are you ready to let go of the plan enough to get the conversation started? Is that a challenge for you? If it is, you need to figure out how to prepare, how to think about what you need in advance, and make sure you're not overdoing it. Because the more anxious you are about delivering the feedback, the more likely you are to rely too much on what you've planned to do, because that seems like the best way to approach it, when actually it may not be. Okay, I'm done. Go ahead, Greg.
All right. Let's get into the feedback model. Now that we have this foundation of engagement, now we can actually work on the feedback model. So as you can see here, this is a cyclical thing. We are making the assumption here that you're not just doing one and done feedback. This is an ongoing thing. But it first starts with asking people, how do you want to be perceived? Now, Dale showed us that word cloud earlier where he said, this is how I want to be received. Why don't you take a moment and drop into chat how you personally want to be received? Because this is the foundation of everything moving forward. Think of descriptive words that you would want people to use, adjectives, that you would want them to use when they're thinking of you as a communicator. Earlier, I dropped in clear, concise, and someone they want to work with. We've got approachable, honest, empathetic, kind, providing valuable information, good, compassionate. They're coming in pretty fast. Empathetic, knowledgeable. Yes. Good. By the way, those of you who have dropped some of these descriptors into chat, what you've actually done is you're starting to define your professional brand. We've got constructive, helping them improve, trusting, good. Yeah, you get the idea. So this is the very first thing you want to do when you are coaching one of your direct reports. Ask them, how do you want to be perceived? And inevitably, they will come up with excellent descriptors in the same way that many of you have. So you've got that as the first step. And then there is some sort of a communication event. By a communication event, I mean, maybe the person you're coaching is running a meeting or delivering training or delivering a presentation or what have you, but you are there observing them. So let me share with you a story to bring this model to life. Here's an image of two individuals in a car. They are colleagues, and they're doing what's called a ride-along. A ride-along, for those of you who are in sales management, you probably know exactly what this is. You shadow one of your direct reports and you see them in action, and then you provide feedback. And you might do that over the course of a day or a few days. In this particular case, we have Edgar. Edgar is a salesperson, and Kate is his manager. Now, Edgar and Kate work for a dentist supply store or a company. Let's say that they sell everything that you might see in your dentist, from the chairs and the x-ray machines all the way down to dental floss. And it's Edgar's job to go to dentist offices and have conversations with maybe the office manager, or maybe in some cases even the dentist, him or herself, who owns the practice. His number one goal is to sell them whatever supplies they need to run their operations. So in this case, Kate is shadowing Edgar as he has these conversations all day long. So back to our feedback model. Kate has asked Edgar, how does he want to be perceived? And he has answered by saying he wants to be described as professional, expert, their go-to guy, solution oriented, and in tune with them. So this is starting to define Edgar's professional brand, and Kate will, throughout the day, coach him on specific and actionable techniques that he can use to meet those goals. So if we go back to one of the questions we asked earlier about, have you ever received difficult feedback or it didn't sit very well. Sarah, you mentioned that the feedback you received was vague and not very actionable. Well, the person who was coaching you probably didn't ask how you want to be perceived, and then the feedback they gave you didn't make any sense. So we want to avoid that. So we've asked Edgar, how does he want to be described? We have an answer. Now we are at the communication event. Now let me pause right here, pause the story, so that I can introduce you to the rest of the feedback model, and then we'll get back to the story. So let's just assume there's some sort of a communication event. The first thing when you are providing feedback, and this is counterintuitive, is to not say anything at all other than ask a question about how did they feel they did. The reason you want to get a chance for them to self-assess is because you want to meet them where they are when you're providing feedback. And if you don't know where they are, that's impossible to do. I'll come back to this thought in a minute. First of all, I want to introduce the rest of the feedback model. So we have the communication event. You ask them how they think that went, and then you earn the right to provide your own observation. But you're probably going to observe and talk about multiple things, which means you need to prioritize rather than just dumping a lot of feedback on that person. You want the feedback to be bite-sized because you want them to be successful. So that means you have to prioritize for them. And that might mean that you leave some of the bigger stuff for later on. You make your recommendation, and then if you can, it's great to be able to tie that recommendation back to the goals that the person set for themselves. So that's how the feedback model works. Now let's go back to our story, and I will put it into action for you. So Edgar had his first sales meeting of the day in the dentist office. Kate observed. They are back in the car after that first meeting. We are at the self-assessment stage here. Remember, it is Kate's responsibility to ask Edgar how he feels that went. So asking very simple questions about emotions is a good place to start. How'd that feel? Now, as the person is answering you, be curious, try the best that you can to reserve judgment, and of course, assume positive intent. Listen well and for nuance. And what I mean by that is listen for what's underneath what they say, because they may not be able to fully articulate how they felt. And of course, wait to respond, and you might need to probe to learn a little bit more. Tell me more, phrases like that. What you're ultimately doing is trying to get a sense of their self-awareness. I said earlier that you have to meet them where they are. Getting a sense of how they think that went is absolutely critical. So here we are, back in the car. Edgar says, I think that went well, but I did interrupt the buyer that one time. All right, we've got something to hang the coaching on here. Now, this is critical. Kate is not speaking. She's only thinking some things at this point. She's thinking, yes, he did interrupt. He also seemed nervous and disengaged. She's also thinking, and he missed some cues, and he spoke quite quickly. All right, now back to our model. This is where it's time for Kate to provide her own observation. So now she's going to say some things like, here's what I saw. So here we go. She says, I noticed that interruption too. I also noticed that you didn't really look at them very much or very often, and you spoke very fast. She goes on to say, I don't think you noticed when he was shaking his head no about the additional software option when you brought it up. Now Edgar says, oh, you're right. I didn't notice that. Edgar just gave us some pretty good information right here, and it's that he's open for feedback. So good for Edgar. So now back to our model. We need to prioritize and simplify for this person. Avoid piling too much on or overwhelming the person. So Kate is thinking, okay, lack of eye contact led him to missing some cues. I could go there. I could also focus on the fact that he was interrupting the dentist, but he was also speaking fast. But again, she needs to prioritize. So she's going to prioritize the lack of eye contact. Why is she doing that? Because she knows our model and she knows that we always start with engagement, and eye contact is one of the two key skills it takes to help people get engaged. So now it's time for her to make her recommendation. And going back to what we've mentioned a few times already, you want them to be successful. So make sure that whatever feedback you're giving is achievable and actionable. Saying you need better leadership, neither of those things, right? Okay, so here we are back in the car. Kate says, it's important that you be able to really see them and notice their facial expressions and your body language. So she says, on this next visit, now remember, she's shadowing him all day long. So on this next visit, I'm going to be watching for your eye contact. Edgar says, oh, I've been told before that I seem to be in my head when I get a little bit nervous. That's typical from what I've seen from others. Now, let's pause the story for just a moment. Edgar just gave us a little bit of information. We probably assumed that, or Kate probably assumed that he was nervous, but she didn't really have some hard and fast evidence. But finally, Edgar has admitted that he was a little bit nervous, and that leads him to being in his head and no eye contact. But the other thing that she did, that Kate did, is she says that's typical. She's normalizing this to make Edgar feel as if, he's not the only one that this happens to. This is very natural. Okay, now we want to tie the feedback back to goals. This is about connecting dots to what they said or how they said they wanted to be described. So Kate says, better eye contact will allow you to be more aware of their needs. And this is especially important because you want to be in tune with them and their go-to guy. So what Kate has done right there is she has given Edgar some skin in the game. You said yourself you want to be described as their go-to guy and in tune with them. This is the way to do that. And he says, right. Okay. I just took, maybe 10 minutes to walk you through that entire model. And admittedly, we don't have enough time to dig into more detail, which is why we are providing you with this handout. Kevin is going to drop a link into chat a little bit later. We don't want you downloading it now, so because that's typical in virtual sessions, right? We don't want you to be distracted, so we'll give you access to that a little bit later. Now, some key concepts that I want to make sure that you take away from this portion of today's session is base your feedback on specific communication events. Try not to provide feedback about something that happened a long time ago because that's not really fair. You want them to be focused on the thing that just happened. And use restraint to avoid overwhelming the person who's receiving the feedback. The third point there is focus on the most fundamental skills first. We've said this a few times. Usually that fundamental skill is engagement, and the two skills to get you there are pausing and breathing and eye contact. And then, of course, normalize feedback to avoid those hurt feelings or any resentment that may be a potential. So I will stop right there and ask if there are any thoughts or questions about what we have just been talking about. I'm going to stop sharing. There we go. Any thoughts or questions about that feedback model? And this is that awkward silence that happens in virtual sessions. You'd think we would be used to it after working virtually for so long. It never gets less awkward in my mind.
One thing I want to emphasize, Greg, while people are thinking about how they want to respond, is that those first few steps in this model, the goal setting, seeing how they're feeling about something, then talking about your observations. Notice how long it takes before you get to any sort of recommendation. I'm sorry, I'm getting a spam call here. So the process probably is going to feel really, really slow to you because what you want to do is watch them, give them some recommendations. And we've seen this. I'm thinking back to the dry runs at one of our clients. We've helped them through the dry run process for a training event or whatever the event might be. But what was happening was that people observing the dry run would say, do it this way, say it this way. And that was the only feedback they were giving. And it really was hard for the person receiving the feedback to act on that because it was an unnatural way for them possibly to speak. And the feedback didn't live within the context of that individual's life, their perspective, their needs. So if it feels like you're really, really delaying the feedback, it's good. That's the way it should feel.
Yeah, this takes time. Takes time. Eric is asking a question in chat, Dale. He's asking any tips for how to practice using this process. Do you want to take that?
No, I thought you would. I'm going to give that one to you. Thanks, Eric.
Thanks. Well, Eric, since we are in the business of providing training, that's my obvious answer, right? It does take some training on how to use this process. But take baby steps with it. And I would also say, as you are trying to, work through this process and getting it into your bloodstream so it becomes habitual, you'll make mistakes. We all do. Just recognize that that's a natural part of your learning process. But I also think it's important to let people know that you're going to be doing this. So you normalize giving feedback, and I would recommend that you do that in a group setting. So maybe you have a staff meeting and you say, as a team, I think there's an opportunity for us to work on our communication skills. I'm noticing that we're not as concise as we could be, or whatever the challenges are that your team is facing. And let them know that you're going to be spending some energy on observing them and providing feedback. So that gives them a heads up that this is going to be coming. And so you're starting to normalize that feedback process and then just building it in to your own culture as a manager.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Jacques is saying, what are your views about feed forward versus feedback? I actually don't know the term feed forward. Dale, have you heard that term before?
No, I haven't. I assume it means sort of coaching before an event, giving people recommendations in advance, maybe based on the past.
Yeah, Jacques, if you can come off mute, if that's a possibility for where you're working today.
Hello.
Hi, Jacques. Can you help us understand what feed forward is?
Yeah, my understanding is that feedback is typically about a present or past communication event, while you're in conversation with the giver and the receiver. The conversation may lead into what about the future? So kind of anticipating the future. So going a bit forward. Maybe once you're done with the feedback, maybe taking advantage of the conversation to go forward and anticipating, stimulating, imaginating, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying. That actually makes sense now. And the model actually accommodates for that feed forward, as you call it. So not only in our story between Edgar and Kate isn't just saying, this is what I observed. She's saying, try this next time, right? The whole eye contact thing. So that is actually looking forward. Now, it helps in our story that Kate is observing Edgar all day long. I mean, in reality, Edgar's probably going to visit maybe 5 or 6 dentist office that particular day. In most situations, you probably don't have rapid succession communication events like that, but you can always say, looking forward next week, I know you're doing X. I'm going to be looking for improved eye contact or pausing or whatever the feedback happens to be.
Before we go on, I want to talk about a couple of things that have come in chat. Leah says this is a great model, assuming that both parties are aware and receptive. Absolutely. And part of those first few steps in it are an attempt to make people more receptive and more aware. So theoretically, that's what should be happening there, but I know it's often difficult. And then any tips about working with someone who has little to no self-insight or is resistant? Again, same thing. The two things happen when you ask how did that feel to someone after an event. Either they are right about how it went or they are wrong. And when they are wrong, it's your job to find a way to make sure that they see things as they actually are. Of course, in our line of work, we're always using video recordings, so it's easy to do that. But baby steps, I think, is probably the best response there. You're not going to accomplish everything during the first feedback session, but you can start taking baby steps with it.
It's a great
Okay.
question.
Yeah, it is. I am going to share my screen. I want to talk a little bit about resonance and efficiency, and this is going to be fairly fast. You're going to be getting a handout about this so that you could look at it in more detail. Okay, in our work, we understand the fact that people have a default approach to business communication. So the question we always ask is, who are you more like? Are you a writer or an improviser? This is clearly seen with presentations, but it's also seen in feedback sessions. So writers thrive with organization and preparation. They often feel there isn't enough time to prepare. They want structure. They're naturally thorough, careful, and detailed. All those things are really good. The challenge for writers is that they can be inflexible and strict. So when I was talking earlier about relying too much on your preparation, you might be a writer. Improvisers thrive with their connection to the people they're talking to, which means they might delay prep. You want to be spontaneous and engaged. They are responsive and unafraid to make last minute changes. The challenge for them is that they can lose focus and be confusing. So what you want to do, once you understand what your default approach is try to work a bit to the other side, to try to find a compromise so that you have both the structure that you need and the conversational qualities that the conversation needs to have. So take a look at this assessment. I'm going to put it in for you to download in a bit. Take a look at it. Think about their involves pages that look like this. And what these are is they talk about, as you can see, it's sort of a pathway from top to bottom. The starts out with basic assumptions, things that those assumptions can lead to, adjustments that you can make, and so on. So take a look at these things and see what jumps out at you. And maybe you'll get some insight into how you are naturally wired to deliver feedback, and then ideas about what you could do to adapt to your default. And one final thing, team dynamics. You want, as you can see at the bottom, play to people's strengths and watch for weaknesses. Now, if you and the person you're coaching or giving feedback to are both writers, that may mean that you focus too much attention on what the writer's strengths are and not enough on what the improviser's strengths are. Same occurs on the other side of the slide with improviser, and writer improviser at the bottom. You think that would be sort of an ideal situation, but actually it's not, because those types often butt heads. And if you have someone that you really struggle to give feedback to, it might be because you have opposite defaults. They just approach things differently than you do, and it's a struggle for you to look at things from their perspective. And so understanding what your default is and understanding what their default is a good way, a good first step, a good way to open up the conversation sometimes during feedback, because it's a fundamental difference in how you're wired. Okay, Greg, this is back to you.
All right, let me share my screen and we will bring this whole webinar home. So we mentioned that, there are multiple communication events that in our story. So let's go back to, we've just had the second meeting of the day, and Kate is thinking, well, eye contact? He worked on that. It's getting better. But, uh-oh, it doesn't stop there. She's also recognizing that his meetings start out chaotic, and she thinks that he confuses people. So I want to introduce you to another tool. We talked about engagement is usually the first recommendation that we make, foundational recommendation. Framing a conversation is, generally speaking, the second. So what do we mean by a framing strategy? Well, every meeting, presentation, or whatever, any type of orderly conversation has three parts: an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. We could also add a pre-part, if you will, and it's that informal chit chat that happens before a meeting takes place. You know, the how are you? How are the kids? Boy, that was some game last night. Hey, have you seen the latest movie? That chit chat is actually very, very important to building relationships, but the business is paying us to get some work done. So we have to formalize the conversation. In other words, we need to answer two very important questions. The first, what are we talking about? And the second, why? Why are we talking about it? If you answer those questions early on in a meeting, probably the rest of the meeting is going to, well, it'll start with a good foundation at least. So if you find that your direct reports are a bit chaotic in their meetings, don't have very much structure, helping them understand this framing strategy might be the next best thing for you. Now, there's a framing strategy worksheet. We're going to give you access to this also a little bit later. If we had time, we would go into detail, but we don't. But anyway, just recognize that this tool is designed to answer those two important questions. What are we talking about and why? Now, finally, let's get at coaching others in the moment. We introduced you to some concepts and tools. The very foundational piece here is the model itself, but some tools to help you implement the model were just the basic concept of an orderly conversation. Let me just add here, a lot of times when we introduce the concept of an orderly conversation, people will say things like, "Whoa, mind blown," or "This is groundbreaking for me. This changes everything." Yeah, we were all taught to deliver speeches at school, right? And an orderly conversation is not a speech. So maybe just flipping that switch in people's brains is a good place to focus. We also introduced you to this notion of your default approach. How am I wired? How's the person I'm coaching wired? And what does that mean? We talked through engagement skills, and then I just introduced this very quickly, this framing strategy. So there are a few scenarios, and because we're running a couple minutes behind, I'm not going to do all 4 of these, but let's zoom in on the first scenario. This is Tomas. Tomas is a terrific coder. He's been with your company since the scrappy startup days of your growing high-tech company that serves the healthcare industry. So we've got a coder. We probably know that he's very detail-oriented, and you're in the healthcare industry. Tomas was recently promoted to your team, which focuses on customer engagement. In his new role, he is often asked to join virtual customer support calls to walk users through some of the trickier features of the software. So software demos is what Tomas is doing. However, you've noticed that he's all over the place when talking people through the software. He speaks very fast and bounces from topic to topic. In the end, he tends to cause more confusion than he alleviates. And now you're regretting having asked him to speak at the upcoming user conference. You need to find a way to help him get focused and slow down. But how? So let me assume that I am Tomas's manager. He's very detail-oriented. He's all over the place. He causes more confusion than he alleviates. And he speaks fast. So if I were going to coach Tomas, I would probably start to wonder, engagement is probably where to start. Why engagement? Because he doesn't seem to be engaged. He doesn't seem to be able to read the room. He's just going at a mile a minute. So probably working with him on pausing and breathing would really help. It would also help him slow down. Giving somebody the feedback, slow down, is not very helpful. That just means people will try to do this and they will fail. But if you encourage people to pause between thoughts or pause between sentences, then at least that gives their brains a moment to catch up, and it gives other people a moment to digest what they just said rather quickly. So pausing eye contact probably is the place to start. But he's also all over the place, which means probably we would want to introduce him to the framing strategy as well, to help him lay a foundation so that there's some structure around his product demos. So that's how I would start. And of course, I would use the feedback model with Tomas. Let's go to, let's see, do we have time? Yes, I do have time for another scenario. So let's go to scenario number 3. This is a complicated one. As the EVP of sales for a Fortune 500 food manufacturing company, you have hundreds of sales teams across the globe. So you are responsible for literally hundreds of salespeople. You're proud of the sales training your team created a few years ago, but you're noticing something that you didn't see coming. The newer salespeople simply aren't cutting it. You brought some of your best sales managers together to discuss what's going on, and it became clear that it all boiled down to the lack of communication skills. Grocery chains are not taking advantage of the special promotions because the salespeople aren't communicating the value, and it is as simple as that. So as salespeople, your teams are failing. The question now is what to do about it. Well, again, we have all of these tools that are available. So if I were in this position, let's say I'm the head of sales for this company, I would start thinking, I've got a big problem I need to solve. They're not being very good salespeople. What in the world would I do? Well, I would probably start again with engagement, but I've got so many people to train. How in the world am I going to do that? This is where managers come in. It would be a very good idea to train the managers on the feedback model so that they can work individually with each of the members on their team. They would then be able to choose which of these tools would be most appropriate for each of the individuals, and it is individual. So when you are thinking about feedback, if you've got multiple teams that you are working with, it might be time to train the managers so that they can train everybody else. All right, I mentioned that we're just a little bit behind schedule. No big deal though. I want to wrap things up so we can get on with our days. You may have noticed that I tend to use some sales specific language. I'm the sales guy here at Turpin Communication. I can't hide that. So if you do think that there is an opportunity to bring this sales model either to yourself, the feedback model to yourself or to your teams, we're happy to talk with you about how we might be able to do that. And Kevin just dropped into chat a link to my meeting scheduler. Feel free to schedule 30 or 45 minutes for us to just do a little bit of chit chat to see what the issues are and how we might be able to help you out. Now, as you may know, if you've been coming to Turpin Communication webinars, we do this regularly. Our next one is scheduled for November 5th. This one is going to focus specifically on presentation skills for subject matter experts. So if you are the type of person who is very detail oriented, you are a subject matter expert trying to communicate your expertise to other people, this is going to be a good webinar for you. So Kevin just dropped the registration for this webinar into chat as well. All right, Kevin's a very busy guy right now because he's going to start dropping all kinds of stuff into chat. It'll be links to all of this, the variety of resources that we have shared with you today. And we wanted to do this a little bit early before the top of the hour so you have time to download whatever you need. There he goes. And while you are downloading, I just want to say thank you very much for joining us today for this webinar. We really appreciate it. And we hope that we've been able to open your eyes to how you can, without fear, provide feedback to the people that you work with. And I will stop talking. I'm going to take us to gallery view, and we'll entertain any last minute questions that you may have. And while you're formulating those questions, I do want to say, one of the things that we talk about as communication trainers all the time is do your best to end meetings early, because people need just a few moments to get themselves situated to, put today's content to bed and then get ready for whatever is next. So try to provide a little bit of extra time for people. People appreciate that.